It's March 17, 1943, and Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of German military intelligence, is holding a document that speaks of a truth so overwhelming it could change the course of the war. This wasn't some piece of propaganda. It wasn't just a lie from enemy agents. No, this was something far worse, cold, hard facts. American factories were working at a scale so massive, so efficient, that it made everything the Nazis had assumed about military production seem laughable. But Canaris couldn't believe it. He wouldn't believe it, not until the very core of his doubts were tested by the evidence laid out before him. Reports flooding in from spies in Mexico City, intercepted communications, and first-hand accounts from business contacts detailed something almost unimaginable. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run factory in Michigan was producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. That's one bomber, with 1.5 million parts, being assembled in a factory longer than most football fields, moving through the production lines faster than the German military could build a truck. This was not just a factory. This was a machine unlike anything the world had ever seen, a symbol of industrial power so staggering that even the Germans could hardly grasp its implications. But here's the thing. Canaris didn't just have the intelligence reports. He had lived it. This wasn't just theoretical information to him. As chief of intelligence, he knew exactly what this meant. If the Americans could do this, if they could produce bombers at this rate, they would eventually overwhelm the German forces. It was just a matter of time. The problem was, time was something the Third Reich couldn't afford. Now, this isn't just about numbers. It's not just about planes, workers, or factories. It's about something far more profound, the failure of the Nazis to grasp the full weight of what they were up against. You see, in early 1943, Germany still underestimated the United States. Even after Pearl Harbor, after the Americans had entered the war, key figures in the German military believed the U.S. would be unable to match their own industrial and military power. It was this underestimation that led to the catastrophic failure of German intelligence, one that would contribute directly to the downfall of the Third Reich. Why didn't the Nazis believe the reports? Why did the German leadership continue to doubt the reality of American industrial power? The answer, though shocking, is simple. It was a failure of ideology. A deep-seated belief that the Germans were the superior race and that anything built by the Americans, by their diverse population, by their weakened democracy, couldn't possibly match up to the efficiency and precision of the Nazi war machine. The very idea that African Americans, women, and immigrants could be part of the workforce assembling bombers was too much to handle for the Nazi leadership. This deep-seated racial prejudice clouded their judgment and led them to reject reality in favor of their own delusional worldview. And yet, despite these intelligence failures, American industry kept producing. And while German intelligence officers gathered reports from all over the world, through agents in Mexico, Spain, even Sweden, none of it ever seemed to convince Hitler or his generals that the United States was a real threat. Canaris's desperation grew as the evidence stacked up. He knew they were headed toward a disaster, but could not get the leadership to listen. It's as if the Germans were doomed to failure before they even acknowledged the real enemy: American industrial might. The turning point came on a fateful day in 1943, when Canaris presented his most detailed intelligence to Hermann Göring, the man in charge of the Luftwaffe. He laid out the facts. Ford's Willow Run plant was producing bombers at a rate that no German factory could hope to match. With every passing month, the Americans were building not just planes, but the future of warfare itself. Göring's reaction, however, was anything but rational. Laughing dismissively, he mocked the idea that the Americans could produce bombers like sausages, referring to it as impossible. In his mind, there was no way a nation that built refrigerators and cars could suddenly become a superpower of warplanes. What Canaris and his team couldn't understand was that the Germans were looking at American production through the wrong lens. They were blinded by ideology, unable to see what was really happening. And despite the overwhelming evidence, photographs, intercepted documents, even film footage, Göring refused to accept the facts. Even when Canaris personally brought him film footage of the factory in full operation, showing B-24 bombers being assembled on a conveyor belt, Göring rejected it, dismissing it as staged propaganda. This refusal to accept the truth would ultimately seal the fate of the German military. While Canaris and his team worked tirelessly to alert the German leadership, the Americans were already building thousands of bombers, fighters, and other aircraft, at a pace that the German factories couldn't match. In fact, by the time the Germans finally accepted that the American numbers were accurate, it was too late. The German Air Force had already been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the American bombing raids. But what was it that allowed America to do this? How could a country so seemingly ill-prepared for war, with such a short time to ramp up production, become the dominant industrial force of World War II? The answer lies in the American ability to innovate, organize, and produce at a scale unimaginable to the rest of the world. By the summer of 1943, American industry was not just keeping pace with wartime demands, it was surpassing them. At the Willow Run plant, workers, many of whom were women and minorities, were creating bombers at an unprecedented rate. These workers were not just performing tasks. They were part of a massive, coordinated effort that united the entire country in the war effort. Ford's workers built aircraft with precision, breaking the process into repeatable, smaller tasks that could be taught to nearly anyone in a matter of days. This allowed for an efficient assembly line that could turn out finished bombers every hour, something that was not just revolutionary, but transformative in the context of modern warfare. Yet, even as the Germans gathered intelligence from sources around the world, they couldn't fathom what was happening in America. They couldn't accept that such a vast, complex, and diverse workforce could produce machines of war on such a massive scale. Instead, the Nazi leadership continued to dismiss these reports as fabrications, delusions, or exaggerated claims. As a result, they failed to adjust their strategy, and by the time they recognized the truth, it was too late to catch up. The critical flaw in the Nazi approach was their refusal to acknowledge the power of diversity and the strength of democracy. They viewed the American workforce as weak, inefficient, and divided, unable to achieve what they believed only a homogeneous society could. But the reality was far different. The strength of the American war effort was not just in its industrial capacity, but in the unity of its people, all working together, regardless of race, gender, or background. Canaris, knowing the consequences of this failure to act on intelligence, watched helplessly as the Germans continued to wage war under the illusion of superiority. The intelligence reports, while accurate, were dismissed by a leadership trapped in its own ideology. This failure to recognize and respond to the scale of American production ultimately led to the downfall of Nazi Germany and the collapse of the Third Reich. But the American industrial miracle didn't just change the outcome of the war, it reshaped the world. The United States, through its unmatched ability to produce at scale, demonstrated the power of innovation, organization, and unity in the face of adversity. And while the Germans continued to fight a losing battle, the Americans were building the future. They were not just building bombers. They were building the foundation for the post-war world. This story, filled with the mistakes of one of history's most formidable regimes, serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of believing the facts, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. It also shows the transformative power of innovation and unity, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The Germans couldn't see it, but the Americans understood that their strength lay not just in their factories, but in their people. And in the end, it was this strength that secured victory. By the summer of 1943, American manufacturing was no longer just meeting the needs of the war. It was exceeding expectations in ways that German intelligence couldn't fathom. Every day, the United States was proving that the strength of their economy, their people, and their industrial might was too powerful to ignore. Yet in Germany, the belief that their society and war machine were superior remained unshaken. As the war raged on, the Nazi leadership continued to be blind to the immense capabilities of the American production machine, as if unable to accept that their supposed inferior enemies were capable of outproducing them in every way. The Germans' refusal to believe in the truth about America's industrial power didn't just cost them on the battlefield, it cost them their understanding of the war itself. They thought that if they could maintain superiority in strategy, tactics, and technology, they could still prevail. But what they missed was the incredible fact that the American industrial capacity was outpacing them. While the German military was bogged down with strategic blunders and costly battles, the U.S. was building an army of machines, weapons, and most importantly, bombers. And those bombers would soon be raining down on Germany with devastating effects. While the Germans scoffed at the reports, the Americans were quietly building the arsenal that would ultimately crush their enemies. By 1944, the Ford Willow Run plant alone was producing hundreds of bombers every month, more than the entire German aircraft industry could manage in a year. They were building bombers with parts that fit together like clockwork, each worker focused on one small task, performing it with mechanical precision. This was not just a factory, it was the heartbeat of American victory, and every hour that passed saw another bomber rolling off the assembly line, ready to fight the Nazis on their soil. The implications of this production capacity were enormous. The scale at which the United States could mobilize its industrial capacity had never been seen before in history. Imagine a single plant producing over 600 bombers a month, while German factories were stretched thin, struggling to meet their own needs. The Germans couldn't understand how this was possible. They had no concept of how a diverse workforce made up of women, African Americans, and immigrants could work together so efficiently to create something as complex as a bomber. To them, the idea that these weakened groups could outperform their own supposedly superior race was nothing short of unfathomable. But the reality of American production didn't stop there. The United States wasn't just making bombers. They were making history. While the Germans continued to pour resources into failed projects and wonder weapons, the Americans focused on practical production. They didn't waste time on theoretical weapons or flawed strategies. They built what they needed, when they needed it, and they did it at a pace that the Germans couldn't match. Even as German leadership continued to reject the evidence, the American factories were humming with activity, churning out more machines of war than the Germans could ever hope to build. As we look back, it's hard to imagine how anyone could have been so blind. But the truth is that the Germans were victims of their own ideology. They couldn't accept the reality that democracy, this so-called weak system, was capable of producing machines of war at an unimaginable scale. They refused to see that their system, built on racial superiority and centralized control, had no chance against the power of a free, open, and diverse society. The belief that they were destined to win the war was so ingrained that they couldn't see the truth that was right in front of them, and that blindness to reality would ultimately lead to their downfall. But while the Germans were stuck in their delusions, the Americans were quietly and steadily winning the war. With each passing day, the factories grew louder and more efficient. The machines of war kept rolling off the production lines one after another, each new bomber a testament to the power of American industry. The United States had cracked the code of mass production, and the world was about to learn just how powerful that code could be. Meanwhile, the German military continued to focus on their own strategies, which were failing miserably. They were fighting battles they couldn't win and wasting resources on technologies that weren't working. Even when they were presented with intelligence showing just how badly they were outproduced, they dismissed it as lies or exaggerated propaganda. But the truth, as history shows, was far more devastating. It was reality that was killing them. The Germans had underestimated the American capacity for innovation and adaptation. They couldn't grasp how quickly the United States was able to pivot from a peacetime economy to a wartime powerhouse. While the Germans were still fighting battles on multiple fronts, the Americans had already won the most important battle of all, the battle of industrial production. The Nazi leadership simply didn't understand that this was the kind of battle they couldn't win, no matter how hard they tried. By early 1944, the American war machine was in full swing. The number of bombers being produced was staggering, and the quality of those bombers was beyond anything the Germans could imagine. Even as the American war effort continued to grow stronger, the Germans remained locked in a futile struggle against the inevitable. The sheer scale of American production was something the Germans couldn't even begin to fathom, and it was this miscalculation that ultimately doomed their efforts. It wasn't just about military strategy. It was about understanding the basic realities of industrial capacity and production. The Americans didn't just build bombers, they built the future. Every day that passed saw the Germans losing more ground, as the United States delivered blow after blow to their infrastructure. The American bombers, each one built with precision and efficiency, would soon be over the skies of Germany, unleashing devastation on a scale that the Germans were completely unprepared for. The factories that once churned out German tanks and planes were now running out of resources, while the American factories kept producing at full capacity. The war in Europe was far from over, but by mid-1944, the Americans had already sealed the fate of Nazi Germany. The German leadership, so sure of their own superiority, had missed the most important lesson of all, that industrial might, combined with a united people, was an unstoppable force. The Americans had turned the tide of the war with their factories, and now the Germans were feeling the full brunt of their mistake. But what did it mean for the ordinary soldier on the ground? For the German troops, this industrial power wasn't just a distant, abstract concept. It was real, it was tangible, and it was slowly suffocating them. With each bomber that took to the skies, the chances of survival grew slimmer. The once proud German military, built on the strength of its soldiers and its equipment, was being overwhelmed by a force they didn't understand, couldn't fight, and ultimately couldn't stop. And so, as the war dragged on, the Germans found themselves at a crossroads. They were faced with an enemy they couldn't outproduce, couldn't outmaneuver, and couldn't overcome. The truth of the American war effort had been hidden in plain sight all along. But by the time the Germans finally understood it, it was far too late. The realization that the Americans were simply outproducing them in every aspect of warfare didn't come gradually for the Germans. It was a brutal awakening. By the summer of 1944, the relentless American bombing campaigns were causing severe damage to German infrastructure, and with each passing day, it became more clear that the Nazi war machine was being ground to a halt. Even the elite units, once so formidable, were faltering under the weight of the combined American industrial and military might. German intelligence, despite its efforts to gather crucial information, had completely underestimated the speed and efficiency of American factories. They had no understanding of the scale at which the United States could operate, nor the sheer determination of its workers. The Ford Willow Run plant was emblematic of this production miracle, a facility that could churn out bombers faster than any German facility could produce a fraction of that number. This wasn't just a victory in terms of numbers. It was a demonstration of the power of America's democratic system, where every citizen, regardless of race or gender, had a role to play in the war effort. While Germany continued to pour resources into weapons that often failed to deliver, like the V-2, rockets, and the infamous Tiger tanks, the Americans were outclassing them on every front with practical, functional weapons that were constantly being produced and deployed. By contrast, the German leadership clung to the idea of wonder weapons, which often proved impractical or ineffective when faced with the sheer weight of American production. The more they focused on these long-term, high-cost projects, the further behind they fell. At the same time, American factories weren't just producing bombers, they were producing them with an efficiency that was unprecedented. Workers in Detroit, many of whom had never worked in factories before, were now part of an industrial juggernaut. Women, African Americans, and immigrants worked side by side, building the machines of war. This workforce, once thought to be inefficient or incapable by the Nazis, was proving to be the most productive in the world. The impact of this production couldn't be overstated. By the end of 1944, the United States had produced over 18,000 B-24 bombers alone. This was a staggering number, especially considering the challenges posed by a global war. For the Germans, this represented not just a logistical nightmare, but a complete collapse of their ability to defend themselves. As more bombers filled the skies over Europe, the very heart of the German war effort was being struck. Their factories, their cities, and their defenses were all being obliterated by the weapons they had so foolishly underestimated. In Berlin, the situation was dire. Hitler's generals were scrambling to figure out how to counter this new threat, but they were always one step behind. By 1944, it was clear that the war was slipping away from them. Even their once feared Luftwaffe was now unable to keep up with the American air raids, which seemed to come with relentless precision. The Luftwaffe pilots, trained in tactics that once dominated the skies, were now facing waves of American bombers that seemed to appear from nowhere, overwhelming them in numbers and firepower. One of the most telling examples of this failure was seen in the skies over France in June 1944, during the Allied invasion of Normandy. The Luftwaffe was outnumbered and outgunned, and despite their best efforts, they were unable to prevent the Americans from achieving air superiority. Meanwhile, the American bombers continued to pound German defenses, making it nearly impossible for the Germans to regroup and mount an effective counterattack. What had once been a formidable force in the air was now a shattered remnant, unable to keep pace with the American onslaught. As the war progressed, the inability of German leadership to recognize the magnitude of the American industrial machine was perhaps the greatest strategic error of the entire conflict. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, they refused to accept that the United States could sustain such a production rate. This failure of acceptance, of refusing to believe that the American system could outpace the Nazi war machine, led to a catastrophic miscalculation. The Germans were facing a foe that they had no way of defeating, an opponent whose industrial might was more powerful than anything they had ever encountered. Meanwhile, the American war machine showed no signs of slowing down. By 1945, the United States had not only built more aircraft than Germany had in the entire war, but it had also perfected the logistics of getting those planes to where they were needed. Whether it was a bomber being delivered to Britain or a fighter plane ready for action in the Pacific, the Americans had created an infrastructure that allowed them to keep up with their production rate. The Germans, on the other hand, were still struggling with outdated strategies and failing supply lines, unable to meet the demands of the battlefield. By the time the war was nearing its end in 1945, the United States had produced more than 33,000 aircraft. This was more than 3 times the total number of aircraft produced by Germany during the same period, and it was clear that this disparity had made all the difference. The war was not just being fought with guns and tanks, it was being fought with sheer industrial power. And in that arena, the Americans had emerged victorious. The loss of industrial superiority was devastating for Germany. In 1945, as the Allies closed in on Berlin, the full extent of this failure became undeniable. The German factories, once capable of producing cutting-edge technology, were now crumbling under the pressure of constant bombings and the depletion of resources. The once proud military machine that had invaded Europe was now fighting a losing battle against the unstoppable force of American production. And while the Germans focused on theoretical technologies, the Americans focused on what worked, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The story of Willow Run and the American production miracle is one of the most important lessons of World War II. It shows that, in times of war, industrial might can be just as important as military strategy. The Germans, for all their technological innovation and military might, were ultimately undone by their inability to adapt to the new reality of industrial warfare. The United States, by contrast, had embraced this new reality and was able to use it to turn the tide of the war in their favor. As the war came to an end, the German leadership was forced to face the consequences of their failure to believe the intelligence reports that had been warning them about America's industrial capacity. The truth, which had been so obvious to American intelligence and workers, was something the Germans refused to accept. And that refusal to see the truth was what led to their ultimate defeat. The American war effort, driven by an industrial revolution unlike anything the world had ever seen, proved to be the key to victory. And in that victory, the world learned an important lesson about the power of industrial capacity and the dangers of underestimating your enemies. As the war continued, the consequences of the German leadership's refusal to believe the overwhelming intelligence reports were becoming undeniable. The sheer scale of American industrial power, combined with the ability to produce at an unimaginable pace, would eventually turn the tide in favor of the Allies. The reports that the Germans dismissed were not just accurate, they were prophetic. The most telling moment came in the weeks before D-Day, when the Allied forces had achieved near-total air superiority. The numbers and the facts were on display, as over 11,000 Allied planes flew over France on June 6, 1944, while the Luftwaffe could muster fewer than 300 fighters in response. That staggering gap in aerial power was the direct result of the industrial might of factories like Willow Run, which had turned out bombers at an alarming rate, outpacing the German war machine and ensuring Allied dominance in the skies. For all the German intelligence efforts, the truth was simple. The Americans had been quietly assembling an unstoppable force, and their output continued to grow at a pace the Nazis simply could not match. But it wasn't just about the planes. The failure to understand or accept this scale led the Germans into a spiral of strategic blunders. They continued to pour resources into developing wonder weapons, only to find that the sheer volume of American production could overwhelm any individual technological advances. The Germans were playing catch-up in almost every field, and the cost of that miscalculation would prove catastrophic. Back at Willow Run, the workers, the women, the African Americans, the disabled, the immigrants had built something more than just bombers. They had built the very backbone of the American war effort. They were not just building machines of war, but proof that democracy, in its diversity and unity, could harness the power of its people to achieve extraordinary things. In a way, they were dismantling the very ideology that had led to the war in the first place. The production of bombers was not just a matter of military logistics. It was a statement, a testament to the power of freedom and the strength that comes from inclusivity. But for the German leadership, the truth was too much to bear. To accept the reality of American production meant confronting the fundamental flaws in their own worldview. It meant acknowledging that their racial ideology, their belief in the inherent superiority of the Aryan race, was completely wrong. It meant recognizing that the very strength they had attributed to their pure society was nothing compared to the diverse, inclusive, and industrious society that had been built in America. The tragedy, however, wasn't just in the missed intelligence. It was in the lives lost because of the refusal to confront reality. Millions of lives, both military and civilian, were lost in the war, and the failure of German leadership to believe the facts led directly to the prolonged suffering. Had the German leadership accepted the truth about American industrial power earlier, it is possible that the war could have ended much sooner, saving countless lives. The belief in lies, the unwillingness to accept uncomfortable truths, ultimately led to the collapse of the Third Reich. And even after the war, as the pieces of history were put together, the full scope of the failure was revealed. The intelligence was clear. The American war effort had far outpaced anything Germany could have hoped to achieve. The Americans had produced more planes in a single year than the Germans could have in several. The failure to see this early on cost the lives of millions and changed the course of history. In the end, as the war drew to a close and Berlin fell to the Allies, it was clear that the Germans had underestimated not just the might of the American military, but the very nature of democracy itself. They had believed in the weakness of a system built on freedom and diversity, and that belief was their undoing. In the post-war years, the lessons of the failure of German intelligence would be studied, not just by historians but by military strategists around the world. The myth of the invincible Nazi machine was shattered by the truth. It was not about the strength of the military, but about the ability to adapt, to work together, and to harness the collective power of a society working toward a common goal. The German spies had counted the planes, had gathered the intelligence, but the Nazis had failed to believe it. This story of industrial and strategic miscalculation serves as a warning for all future generations. It is a lesson about the dangers of ideological blindness and the importance of facing reality, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. In war, as in life, the truth will eventually prevail, whether you're ready for it or not. The story of Willow Run is not just about airplanes. It's about the resilience of democracy, the power of diversity, and the unwavering truth that reality does not bend to those who refuse to see it. The German intelligence officers who knew the truth lived with the consequences of their silence. Some were executed, others escaped, but the price of ignoring reality was steep. The war was won not just on the battlefield, but in the factories of America, where the production of planes, tanks, and bombs proved that democracy, despite all its flaws, could rise to meet the challenge of totalitarianism. The final intelligence report from Germany's own officers, dated April 20th, 1945, Hitler's last birthday, revealed the truth. "We reported this truth 2 years ago," the report said. "We were not believed. By then it was too late." The American bombers, many of them built at Willow Run, delivered the final blow to the Reich, proving once and for all that industrial might, when harnessed by a free people, could change the course of history. This story is not just about the failure of German intelligence, but about the power of truth, the importance of believing in the facts, and the catastrophic consequences that arise when we ignore what is plainly in front of us. The world learned a powerful lesson from the fall of the Third Reich, and that lesson is as relevant today as it was then. Never underestimate the power of a united free people working together toward a common goal. The success of Willow Run and all that it represented is a testament to what we can accomplish when we believe in the strength of our ideals, our people, and the truth. The history of World War II is full of lessons, but perhaps none so clear as this. The truth will always find a way to break through, even when those in power refuse to acknowledge it. The fate of nations hinges on their ability to accept reality, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. And for Germany, their refusal to do so sealed their doom. The legacy of Willow Run and the workers who built the planes that helped defeat the Nazis endures. It serves as a reminder that no matter how powerful an enemy may seem, the truth and the strength of a united people can always prevail. The war may have been fought on battlefields, but the real victory was won in the factories, where democracy showed the world what it was truly capable of.